Hello everyone, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for joining us. So let's start the show with a quick recap of everything that's been going on. And we begin with the news that two back-to-back shootings took place in Buffalo, New York and Laguna Woods, California, and a horrific school shooting in Texas. Australia saw its Conservative Party turned out of power in both Parliament and the Prime Ministership. And former President George W. Bush made this incredible Freudian slip when talking about Russian President Vladimir Putin while giving a speech in Dallas.
Russian elections are rigged. Political opponents are imprisoned or otherwise eliminated from participating in the electoral process. The result is an absence of checks and balances in Russia and the decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of of Ukraine. Iraq, anyway.
Wow, that was incredibly surprising. But then again, both Bush and Putin, surprisingly, have some things in common. They both invaded countries with faulty intelligence, conjured up baseless justifications for doing so, and both have built reputations as war criminals. So if he lives in a glass White House, he definitely shouldn't be throwing any stones. As much as I'd like to make fun of this gaffe, we instead have to once again talk about the midterm elections, with the news that Madison Cawthorn, North Carolina congressman and CW drama villain, was denied a second term in Congress, and the same group that helped push Cawthorn out now had its eyes set on the primary on June 28th in Colorado to oust GOP Congresswoman Lauren Boebert, seen here looking like the female villain in the most recent Degrassi spinoff. Now, like Cawthorn, not only does Boebert have her own share of scandals, but she also has a long rap sheet, along with a bad reputation of not only being a one-person version of QVC for firearms, but also of poorly handling financial disclosures when it comes to both her campaign's money and her husband's finances.
August, news broke that Boebert did not disclose almost $500,000 her husband made in the energy industry. Ethics and campaign finance laws require candidates and members of Congress to disclose how immediate family members make money so voters know about potential conflicts of interest.
Now we have learned that Boebert paid rent and utility bills for her restaurant with campaign funds, which is very much in violation of federal campaign finance laws, the new filings of the Federal Election Commission show. And this is not the first time Boebert has misused campaign funds. In February, the Denver Post reported Boebert paid herself more than $22,000 in mileage reimbursements for her campaign account last year. To justify those reimbursements, Boebert would have had to drive, get this, 38,712 miles while campaigning, despite having no publicly advertised campaign events in March, April, July, and only one in May.
Yeah, that's not great, is it? Especially when you get called out for filing information that's not true in legal documents and essentially possessing conflicts of interest like you just don't care. Now, I have to say that Boebert has since amended her filings to better represent the number of miles that she's driven. But it's not just a disregard for laws regarding campaign finance, because she's also faced other allegations regarding mishandling money and even people who work for her. Take her restaurant in her hometown of Rifle, Shooter's Grill, which she opened in 2013. The restaurant basically has a politically conservative social atmosphere, with waiters and other staff members openly carrying holstered handguns, and there's gun-related paraphernalia everywhere. When Nightline did a segment on her restaurant in 2014, she went out of her way to paint her restaurant as a friendly atmosphere where people who eat and work there can feel safe, although watch one waitress respond when the ABC News reporter asked what happens when a customer leaves a less than desired tip.
Nightline ventured to Colorado's western slope to check it out. Inside, the place is packed, and the waitresses packing.
What is this?
It's a Ruger 357 Black Hawk.
Good kick? I mean, is it?
It's got a pretty hard kick, but nothing that I can't handle.
And they are fully loaded.
Does anybody dare leave a small tip?
They still tip like normal people, you know, so, I mean, it's not like we're gonna shoot them or anything if they leave us a small tip.
Oh, that's reassuring. I was totally worried about the possibility that you would point your revolver and or Glock 9 at me if I tipped you less than 15%. But you saying that makes me feel all warm inside, and that feeling is definitely not from the general fear of being shot by Old Tavern Barbie there because I gave her a bad tip. So thanks, Barbie. You really made me feel safe with that reassurance, and I really wish this ended with me having food in my stomach and not bullets piercing through it. Now, while the interaction with those waitresses that reporter had may make the restaurant seem like a really nice small business to work at, but you should know, those waitresses didn't exactly paint the full picture as the restaurant actually is. Because if Boebert was promoting her business or her positions on the Second Amendment, that would be one thing. But the reality about working for her at that restaurant is far different than it's shown on television. When Mother Jones did an investigative piece on Boebert, they found that the work environment Boebert fostered there was absolutely horrifying. Allegations were made by employees that really paint her as a terrible boss. 5 former employees at her restaurant say she failed to pay her employees on time, with one saying that the second the restaurant blew up, her head blew up and it became something entirely different, going on to say that she got to meet a new version of her that is essentially a monster. Not just that, but employees were paid sometimes in cash, either out of the register or the wallet of Boebert's husband, with no tax deductions. And when some workers were struggling to get by, Boebert spent exorbitant sums of money that the restaurant earned on, among other things, private school tuition for her 2 sons, breast implants, and a Cadillac SUV. And her behavior was even more appalling as an employer. She was frequently absent from only showing up when the camera crews were present, with one former employee saying if she would come into the restaurant, everyone just knew we were just going to have a bad day because she would just walk around and nitpick. And look, as tempting as it is to look at her record as a bad restaurant operator, which she clearly is, especially with Shooter's Grills having a Yelp reviews like, and these are real, food is awful, burgers taste like roadkill, terrible food, terrible service, terrible people, I got food poisoning from their horrible place, and my favorite one, rubber sausage, cold eggs, lukewarm coffee, also overpriced. And that's not that surprising, since according to her restaurant's actual menu, the price of a burger is as high as $11. That much for a stupid burger? That's gotta be criminal, and I say that considering the fact that Boebert has an actual criminal record. Because according to the Colorado State Police records, she has had a number of run-ins with law enforcement between 2003 and 2020, most of which resulted in her either failing to show up in court or pleading guilty, with notable incidents like interfering with the arrest of minors caught drinking alcohol, insisting the arrest was illegal, and telling the boys to flee, and insisting that she had friends at Fox News, and the arrest would be national news, allowing her pit bulls to attack her neighbor's dog, who thankfully survived, and being a witness to an incident in 2004 in which her now husband and then boyfriend exposed himself to 2 teenage girls at a bowling alley, which resulted in him serving 4 days in jail and 2 years probation. And she could be potentially vulnerable here, because as some of the former president's candidates have been in North Carolina and Georgia, both states that have open primaries and where Democrats pull GOP primary ballots to vote down his preferred candidates. Colorado actually has an open primary and is set for later this month, meaning that unless some Democrats choose to vote in her district's GOP primary, she will be the nominee and run for another term this year. Now, for the final part of this recap, we have to turn to the Philippines, the country that gave us, among other things, Bruno Mars, Olivia Rodrigo, Rashawn Fagan, and the most important celebrity of all, Jollibee. I mean, he's just an absolutely fun bumblebee who wants to serve you fried chicken, hula burgers, and spaghetti, and he has some seriously sexy dance skills. Yes! There is certainly no other fast food mascot that can be as cool as that one. I mean, what do we have? Burger Joker? Creepy Monarch? Sun-bleached redhead? Hello police, I gave you all the clues? Please, please, please. None of those can even slightly measure up. Now, and I know that bee is just a person in a bumblebee costume, but I don't care because, and this is true, Jollibee can get it. But the reason why we need to talk about the Philippines is because last month they held their elections to replace their outgoing president and self-proclaimed dictator, Rodrigo Duterte, who not only started a drug war that's currently being investigated as potential crime against humanity, but also has a less than ideal way with words.
Gusto ko tawagan, putang ina ka, umuwi ka na.
Just imagine how big a deal it is for the president of the Philippines, a country that is about 80% Catholic, to call the Pope a son of a whore. That is just incredibly shocking. It's like if Joe Biden told Zendaya to go screw herself, he'd be dragged ankles first out of the White House, and rightfully so. Now, Duterte didn't run because the country's constitution limits the president to 1 6-year term, but his daughter Sarah ran for and was elected vice president, a position that's elected separately in the Philippines. But the person who won the presidency there has an even more alarming last name.
A frontrunner in the current polls, Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr. His father declared martial law, ruling the Philippines with a terrible human rights record until a popular uprising ousted him in 1986.
That's right. the son of an infamous dictator in Filipino history, is now expected to become president of the Philippines by the end of the month. And if you want to know why that's so concerning, there are a number of reasons. And before I give you those reasons, it's important to break down the history between the US and the Philippines. The US acquired the Philippines from Spain and made it an American colony in 1898 after we defeated Spain in the Spanish-American War. Then, the Filipinos rose up against us in the Filipino-American War, which resulted in more than 200,000 casualties. Then, we spent decades subjecting the country to racist colonial and imperial rule until 1941, when the Japanese Empire invaded and occupied the country throughout most of World War II until 1945. And even after we granted the Philippines independence in 1946, we continuously used the CIA to meddle in their affairs. It was all behavior that would be best described as, and I don't use this term lightly, borderline redcoat. Now, to understand the problem with Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr., you have to look at the reign of his father, Ferdinand Marcos Sr., who was originally elected as a reformer, but near the end of his second term, Marcos declared martial law, and what he argued was the threat posed by communist and sectarian rebellion in the country, both of which he is believed to have exaggerated, and he held power by suppressing the free press, targeting political opposition and activists and others who fought against the Marcos regime and subjected them to torture, and simultaneously siphoning off money from the government, with the Marcos family reportedly stealing somewhere between $5 to $10 billion. The theft was so large, the Marcos family to this day holds the Guinness World Record for largest theft ever from a government, which is a weird world record to be handing out. That would be like if Ciron won the world record for most bobbies shot. And the Marcos family lived lavishly off their stolen money, with Filipino First Lady Imelda Marcos being shamelessly comfortable at spending it.
Imelda, known as the Iron Butterfly, would become a notorious jet-setting socialite and fashion icon, amassing hundreds of millions in jewels, fine art, real estate. Her travels so luxurious, she once reportedly spent $2,000 on chewing gum during a layover in San Francisco. She even forced an airplane departing Rome to make a U-turn because she forgot to buy cheese.
That is just objectively stupid. Turning an entire plane around for cheese? Come on, there's absolutely no reason to turn a plane around for a dairy product, unless, of course, it's a bottle of Nesquik double chocolate, in which case it's completely warranted. After the Marcos family was ousted in a popular uprising in 1986, they then went into exile in Hawaii, and the new government worked hard to prevent a repeat of the Marcos era. And one of the key things they did was push to claw back the money the Marcoses stole, with the Marcoses challenging the moves by the Filipino government through litigation for years, even after Ferdinand's death in 1989. And the government was able to claw back around $5 billion, or around half what was believed to have been stolen. And his family has refused to pay a tax bill that it now likely amounts to close to $4 billion, including penalties. And even though Bongbong didn't directly aid the graft his family perpetrated, he definitely benefited financially from the money his family stole from serving as a governor during the family's reign to having a very lavish lifestyle. Watch this one moment from his failed campaign as vice president in 2016, where his opponent during a debate called out the graft he benefited from, and his response wasn't great.
Yung apology, voluntarily given yun. Hindi natin yun pwedeng ipilit sa kanya. Pero sa akin yung recognition ng maraming kamalian in the past. Kasali doon yung hidden wealth na hanggang ngayon hindi pa din natin nakukuha. At yun ay nakaw yun sa taong bayan.
I cannot give what I do not have. I do not have what you are. I do not have control. I do not have any knowledge of any of the things. Once again, let me repeat, I cannot give what I do not have.
Okay, I know this isn't important, but I had to point this out. But what I like the most about that clip isn't the inadequacy of Bongbong's answer, but perhaps the sign language interpreter in the corner of the screen there, practically giving everyone an accurate representation of his big crybaby energy vibes there. Now, what makes Bongbong's presidency so troubling is that he could wield power over the two offices that have power over getting the money back his family stole, and possibly making it harder to get all the money they stole out of the Marcos' hands by holding sway over the commission devoted to investigating and recovering the Marcos' loot, as well as the tax office. And it's not just keeping stolen riches that's the problem here, but the fact that the Philippines, which is the most online nation on earth, has seen the history of the Marcos regime be rewritten before the people's very eyes, with online disinformation circulating on platforms like Facebook, painting a rosy picture of the Marcos era that the era of martial law was actually a peaceful and economically prosperous time, when the fact of the reality was it wasn't, as Filipinos during the time were living off of just $2 a day. Now, all of what we've seen this week is what we need to focus on, because we need more people to stand up to political opportunists like these people, whether it's here in the US or abroad. And we should have the same amount of backbone to call out the bullshit of people like these, the same way this sexy bee busts some serious dance moves. And now, this. And now, proof that predicting the weather doesn't always go smoothly.
Could be as much as 10 to 20 millimetres of rainfall, and then we'll see temperatures dropping to around about 11 or 12 degrees Celsius as we go through into the morning. I'll hand you back to Hugh for now, and I'll be back with more for you in half an hour, Hugh.
And Marshall, 50 is the current temperature right now in Winona. Ooh, that's funky. What is going? Ooh. I don't really know what's going on.
And near 30 degrees across central Mississippi. Well, hey there.
I don't know what's going on, but Zane doesn't know. Are you sure? Are you crazy sure?
Well, we've got a little bit of interesting things going on right now. Take a look at what's going on right now. You want to point out the weather right now?
Yeah, there are farts everywhere and toots.
What are we looking at for the week ahead?
Sunshine continues today. Sorry, I'm just kidding. I'm laughing at the bee conference. Oh my gosh, it's back.
We actually have some sunshine for other portions of the Bay Area down towards San Jose, East Bay neighborhoods, but still some stubborn overcast here over the city. Look at this.
He's totally checking out the camera, Mark.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
This is so cool.
Yeah.
Like a crow.
I might need a little more time for this weather segment.
I want you guys to say, wow, that's great news. It's going to be 60 on Friday. Well, I mean, what do you want me to do? Lie to you? I'll put 70 every day next time. God.
Thank you for your commitment.
Man, thank you. Mr. Davis appreciates it. He knows when to bundle up.
Yep.
Here's some wind. Here's some temperature, 20s. Feels like 19 or feels like 70. I don't know. 47, partly cloudy. Southwest breeze 10 to 15. Here's a 60. I don't know if that's good enough for you guys. Get excited. Maybe I'll disappoint you with the 7-day here in a few minutes.
On with the show. The subject of my story this week concerns guns. You know, big metal pew-pew sticks that go boomity bang bang. Now, in America, we have a population of around 330 million people, and the number of guns we have in circulation is around 400 million. So guns are practically everywhere in this country, and when I say everywhere, I do mean everywhere.
How many guns do you think I can hide underneath a Hawaiian shirt? Of course, we got the gray man. Got my Beretta Model 85. Feels like a Car Arms CT-45. Charter Arms, undercover, 38 Special. Grandpa Dave's old Derringer. This is a Sky CPX-2, Smith & Wesson 442. Oh, wait, one more. North American Arms Sidewinder 22 Magnum, just in case you need something small.
Wow, that has to be the second most frightening thing to find in a Hawaiian shirt, other than, of course, John Lasseter. Now, also, I gotta say, the reveal of that plankton-sized handgun in his Tommy Bahama pocket was quite the M. Night Shyamalan-style twist there. Great job, Microgun. You are both superfluous and incredibly surprising. Now, the reason why we need to discuss guns is because of a series of back-to-back mass shootings in New York, Oklahoma, and Texas, the latter of which has been the most heartbreaking news, as a lone gunman with an assault rifle went into Robb Elementary School and killed 22 people, mostly children under the age of 12. And in typical fashion, Republicans went out of their way to blame anything but guns. Wisconsin Senator Ron Johnson, for instance, basically blamed it on things like critical race theory, wokeness, and what he called liberal indoctrination, which is obviously ridiculous. And some went so far as to peddle conspiracy theories about the shooter, like claiming he was an undocumented immigrant, when in fact he was from North Dakota. But perhaps the dumbest thing that they diverted the blame towards was doors. And no one blamed doors more, stupidly, than this guy.
One of the things that everyone agreed is don't have all of these unlocked back doors. Have one door into and out of the school, and have that one door armed police officers at that door.
I do not like that man, Ted Cruz. I do not like his hard right views. I do not like his stupid beard. I do not like him hunting deer. I don't like him making CPAC swoon, nor do I like him in Cancun. I do not like seeing him in sunglasses, nor do I like seeing him kissing asses. I don't like Ted Cruz at all, he makes me sick. That man Ted Cruz can suck my dick. But look, while they make excuses for anything other than the gun used in that massacre, there's actually a reason why they make such excuses, and specifically because there is one group that the Republicans fear the most when it comes to this issue, the gun lobby, which is mostly the National Rifle Association. Now, we actually did a piece on the NRA 2 years ago and said how while they maintained a chokehold on the GOP, that power that they've enjoyed has been weakening amid an avalanche of scandals and serious threats of litigation. And since I did that piece, the NRA's grip has been weakening even more since then. According to financial documents from the IRS and the NRA's own legal filings, over a recent 4-year period, the NRA witnessed a 23% decline in its revenue. And it has even witnessed a decline in the number of its members, as a transcript from a deposition involving the NRA CEO showed that the membership is under 5 million members. And the reason for its decline in revenue and members is a mixture of the embarrassment it has endured from its scandals to accusations that the organization's leaders are wildly out of step with the majority of its members and are not fully listening to the policies that a majority of its members support. And recently, their response to these massacres has always been less than ideal, if not immoral. Despite the massacre happening, just days before it was scheduled to hold its annual conference in Houston, the NRA went ahead with the convention anyway, as well as their concert. Now, after outcry, nearly all the performers who were scheduled to sing at the concert pulled out, leading to the concert being cancelled altogether. And just listen to one of those country music singers that was slated to perform explain why he chose to cancel his set at the NRA's concert in the wake of the Uvalde massacre.
I did not cancel it in protest against the NRA. I'm a card-carrying member of the NRA and have been for 40 years, as was my father and as are my 2 brothers. I canceled it because I didn't think it was a good time to go down to Houston and have a party with them digging 21 fresh graves in the valley of my precious, beloved Texas.
Right. When a community has gone through a heartbreaking tragedy, the correct response is to mourn with them, pay their respects, and help them heal from the scars that the tragedy gave them. The incorrect response would be to channel your inner Steve Stifler and say, all right, everyone, plop a cake and bring on the girls, because it's about to get crazy up in here. So with the issue of gun safety now front and center, things do not look good for the NRA, as a bipartisan group of lawmakers are now working on gun reform, and these 2 Republican members of Congress, Adam Kinzinger of Illinois and Chris Jacobs of New York, have voiced support for a ban on assault-style weapons. Now, if the NRA is potentially losing its grip on the GOP, a bipartisan group of members of Congress are finally taking the issue of overtly lax gun laws seriously, and a March for Our Lives event is set to take place nationwide and in DC to advocate for tougher gun laws just 4 days from now. We thought that this week we'd take another look at the NRA, and we're going to focus on a few things in particular. How has the NRA's advocacy evolved on guns? How does the NRA's board operate? And what can be done, if possible, to change the organization? And before we start, you can't really talk about the NRA without mentioning its longtime executive vice president and CEO, Wayne LaPierre, seen here looking like he's describing the size of his own ego. Now, LaPierre first joined the NRA in 1977 after working for a pro-gun rights Democratic candidate for U.S. Senate in Virginia, and spent years climbing the organization's ranks to become both the group's EVP and CEO, positions that he has held for 21 years now. And in his time as NRA's most notable leader, he has slowly steered the organization towards being against any meaningful forms of gun reform and regulations, something that was evident in his rhetoric over the years. For instance, in a fundraising email LaPierre wrote in 1995 after incidents like the Waco siege and the Ruby Ridge standoff in Texas and Idaho, he referred to the federal agents in both instances as jackbooted government thugs who wear Nazi bucket helmets and black stormtrooper uniforms to attack law-abiding citizens, a letter which led to former President George H.W. Bush to issue a resignation letter from the NRA, saying in it that LaPierre's comments were a vicious slander of law enforcement. And while LaPierre eventually apologized for those comments, it would not be the last time he would make such awful comments. In 2000, LaPierre claimed that Bill Clinton tolerated a certain limit of violence and killing to strengthen the case for gun control and score political points, saying that Clinton had blood on his hands. And in the event of mass shootings, he usually resorts to imaginary boogeymen like gun-free zones, like schools and hospitals, the media, lax security, violent movies, and violent video games, despite the fact that an Oxford study from 3 years ago finding no relationship between aggressive behavior and the amount of time playing violent video games. And while you think that just about anyone can call out LaPierre's comments and figure reporting as bullshit, you should know that blaming everything but the gun is the norm in the NRA's leadership and notable gun rights activists, as well as making chilling rhetoric about their perceived enemies. And it's all done to provoke a response, like this one comment in a speech at CPAC made by former NRA spokesperson Dana Lash about the media coverage of mass shootings following both the Parkland massacre and a CNN town hall she participated in about gun violence prevention.
Many in legacy media love mass shootings. You guys love it. Now, I'm not saying that you love the tragedy, but I am saying that you love the ratings. Crying white mothers are ratings gold.
Oh my god. I didn't think it was possible for someone who cared that much about guns to make such a statement unless they were a firearms company executive or an AR-15 wearing a fake mustache. Now, if you want to know why the NRA is filled with kooks like gun-grabbing Sandra Bullock there, you should know that the organization wasn't always like this. When it was first established in New York in 1871, it was an organization meant to promote guns for recreational use like hunting, and in the decades that followed, the NRA actively worked with the government to ensure restrictive gun laws were put in place, like in the 1930s, in order to prevent machine guns like Tommy guns from getting into the hands of gangs like the ones led by individuals like Machine Gun Kelly and Al Capone, and that began to change in the 1960s after a series of high-profile assassinations like Martin Luther King, Bobby Kennedy, JFK, and Malcolm X led to Congress further tightening gun restrictions in response to those assassinations. Although, you should know, some believe there were other motives for the NRA to lobby Congress to get laws like those passed, and the motive likely involved race. Around the time the bill was passed, it was the height of the Civil Rights Movement, and the Gun Control Act was likely a response to members of the Black Panthers openly and legally carrying guns in organized armed patrol citizen groups in the city streets of Oakland, California, and other major cities. And Black Panther members regularly invoked the Second Amendment as a means to protect themselves from acts of police brutality, and when it was conservatives seeing this, and along with white gun owners, they freaked out. And California responded by passing the state law known as the Mulford Act, which banned the open carrying of a firearm in public without a license. And just listen to the California governor at the time the Mulford Act was passed explain his support for it.
There is absolutely no reason why out on the street today a civilian should be carrying a loaded weapon.
Yeah, and that makes sense to some degree, but doing it because you likely saw a bunch of black people legally carrying guns kind of makes you wonder what other ulterior motivations you had in your policies, like supply-side economics or even public health. Now, this is when the NRA started to transform into the nutty cabal that we know of it as now. As I explained in my first piece on the NRA, the organization has always had a bad relationship with law-abiding gun owners who are African Americans, which led to the founding of gun rights groups exclusively for blacks, like the National African American Gun Association, or NAGA, in 2015. But the real event that started the NRA's spiral into craziness really began in the late 1970s at its annual convention in Cincinnati, where there was a floor rebellion led by Harlan Carter, a Texas lawyer and immigration hawk who was the NRA's president at the time, and is also responsible for finding the NRA's campaign arm, the Institute for Legislative Action. Now, before he entered the picture, there had been a growing shift between the executives who wanted to promote the organization's original mission of promoting guns for recreational use and firearm safety education, and those who wanted to outright oppose new gun laws. And after that Cincinnati revolt, the hardliners won out and took control of the organization. And all of this led to the NRA slowly going from backing a mixture of mostly Republicans and some Democrats to backing Republicans exclusively, with the GOP even changing their party platform to preserve an individual's right to bear arms and claim in 1981, when Republicans in the Senate came out and claimed that they discovered clear and long-lost evidence that the Second Amendment was intended as an individual right of the American citizen, which is weird because I don't recall them presenting that evidence to anyone, unless they hired Nicolas Cage to look for long-lost proof that the Second Amendment didn't need all these limits. There's really no need for them to do that. Now, while most conservatives were with the NRA on slowly peeling off public approval for previous interpretations of the Second Amendment, some conservatives were seeing this as the Republican Party slowly losing its mind and wildly misinterpreting the right to own guns, one of which was former Supreme Court Chief Justice Warren Burger. In an interview with PBS in 1991, Berger came out swinging against their interpretation of the Second Amendment, saying this.
Writing the Bill of Rights now, there wouldn't be any such thing as the Second Amendment.
Which says?
That a well-regulated militia being necessary for the defense of the state, the people's rights to bear arms. This has been the subject of one of the greatest pieces of fraud, I repeat the word fraud, on the American public by special interest groups that I have ever seen in my lifetime. Now just look at those words. There are only 3 lines to that amendment. A well-regulated militia. If the militia, which was going to be the state army, was going to be well-regulated, why shouldn't 16 and 17 and 18 or any other age persons be regulated in the use of arms?
Yeah, it does sound like that, and that's because it is. The way the hard right interprets the Second Amendment as unlimited rights is ridiculous, and you should know that Berger wasn't the only member of the court to hold that view. In the 2008 Supreme Court case of D.C. v. Heller, while the majority of the justices ruled in favor of slapping down D.C.'s tough handgun laws, the justice who wrote the majority opinion, Antonin Scalia, said plainly that the rights guaranteed in the Second Amendment are not unlimited. And of course they're not. Rights are limited in other constitutional amendments like the First Amendment, where you can't shout fire in a crowded theater, or shout bomb on an airliner, or that kid just peed in the pool, when it's pretty clear you're trying to get that entire hotel pool to yourself. So that is how the organization's advocacy has evolved, from promoting hunting, firearm safety education, and gun-related recreation to wildly distorting views on gun ownership. The next question to ask here is, how does the NRA operate? Now, while we focused a lot in our last piece on LaPierre and his clients who helped the NRA stay afloat all these years, it's worth noting LaPierre does not run the organization by himself, as the NRA does have a board of directors who oversee the organization and handle its finances. But the way this board of directors is structured and how its directors are put into power is where the problem with the organization currently lies. The NRA's board of directors is usually composed of the organization's most famous members like LaPierre himself, Ted Nugent, among others, and the way the people get on the board is incredibly surprising. See, nearly all of them are usually cherry-picked by currently existing board members and rely on a host of institutional safeguards to insulate themselves from accountability. Around 1/3 of the NRA's board members turn over every year, and while they hold elections for those board member seats, the eligibility of who can vote in those elections are limited to fully paid lifetime NRA members and people who have been annual members for more than 5 straight years. And the board assembles a nominating committee comprised of 9 people, and they issue formal candidate endorsements where 2/3 of the people on that committee are already board members, essentially proving once and for all the former president, Anakin Skywalker, was right about the elections being rigged, specifically the elections for the NRA's board of directors. And another problem that the NRA has had is how the organization paints itself as representing the views of one group, when it turns out it's painting the group of someone completely different.
If you go to the NRA's website right now, you'll see the group describing itself as America's longest-standing civil rights organization.
We're the largest and oldest civil rights organization in America.
The NRA really wants you to think of it that way, because it frames the organization as essentially a public interest group, alongside groups like the ACLU and NAACP. That framing is the reason the NRA pops up in every debate about gun control. If you think of the NRA as a group that represents gun owners, you can't really debate gun policy without them. The problem is
the way they go about this is a charade. It's a fraud. What they're really doing is representing the interests of the gun companies.
Makes the NRA less of a public interest group and more of an industry lobbying group. And that's a big distinction. We're arguing about gun control with a group that makes money when people buy guns.
Exactly. They like to say that the NRA is pursuing the interests of its members and their civil rights, but in reality, they're covering the asses of the biggest manufacturers of firearms, which is just genuinely ridiculous. It's about as ridiculous as the Irish Supreme Court ruling, and this is true, that bread from Subway isn't actually bread. And that's on top of them making the actual website, subwaytunafacts.com, disputing the idea that it's tuna isn't actually tuna. And I have to say, the moment you realize you had to make a website debunking myths about your restaurant's menu items, it does feel like you're already losing the argument. Now, because the NRA is always lobbying not just Congress but state legislatures across the country to pursue the interests of the biggest gun manufacturers out there, some of these manufacturers clearly know that the way they market their weapons appeals to potential mass shooters, and their marketing ploys at times have been cartoonishly egregious. Take the company that made the rifle used in the massacre in Uvalde, a Georgia-based firearms company producer called Daniel Defense. Just Days before the massacre in Uvalde, the company issued this since-deleted tweet showing a toddler holding an assault rifle in his lap, which is just outright disgusting. And sometimes their messaging has been in a way that seems like common sense, but mostly deserving of heavy skepticism, like this one ad Daniel Defense originally had planned to debut during the Super Bowl several years ago.
It's been a long road getting here. And a lot has changed since I got back. Now this is the center of my world. And my family's safety is my highest priority. I am responsible for their protection. And no one has the right to tell me how to defend them. So I've chosen the most effective tool for the job.
Okay, so while that ad does make it seem like it makes sense that you would want to defend your family from any threat that dare to target them, something tells me that you could just use a simple handgun or rely on hand-to-hand style fighting or just simply improvise. You're a Marine, Dan! You could just rely on your non-gun related training. And because of the egregiousness of their marketing ploys, the families of the Uvalde massacre victims have since signaled that they plan to file a lawsuit against the company over their marketing of their product. And Daniel Defense wouldn't be the only one to face litigation over a massacre. Remington, for instance, filed for bankruptcy after they settled a lawsuit with the families of the victims of the 2012 Sandy Hook massacre in Connecticut for $73 million, which they filed after it turned out that it was a Bushmaster AR-15 rifle used by the shooter. And the way they went after weapons manufacturers was through state law focusing heavily on how the company marketed that specific weapon.
It was, a reissuing of your man card. And the family said that this was a way for violence-prone young men to really get excited about owning a weapon. And the lawyer said, make no mistake, this was a weapon. It wasn't a casual hunting rifle. It wasn't a family Swiss Army knife. It was a weapon of war that the lawyer said was marketed toward civilians, inappropriately so.
All right, so there are plenty of better ways to reissue your man card. For instance, buying a new sports car, getting gold jewelry to wear, dating a model 10 to 20 years your senior. But buying a weapon of war that was meant to kill a large number of people probably shouldn't be one of them. And one thing you should know about how those lawsuits relates to the NRA is because firearm manufacturers owe their asses to the NRA as they lobbied the Bush administration in 2005 to get a bill signed into law that essentially shields firearm manufacturers and dealers from being held legally liable when their products are used to commit crimes. But there are carve-outs, such as when their products are defective, there's a breach of contract, criminal misconduct, or any action where they are found to be directly responsible. They can also be held liable for what's referred to as negligent entrustment, where there is a reason to believe that a gun was intended to be used in a crime, and some gun shops and producers have been held liable for some cases. In Missouri in 2016, a gun store was found liable for selling a gun to a woman with schizophrenia who later murdered her father, and they sold her the gun despite being previously warned by the woman's mother that she was mentally unstable, and the owner specifically instructing his shop employees to sell a gun to those who passed a federal background check. And as a result, the gun store settled the case for over $2 million. So what you have with the NRA here in terms of its leadership structure is a system that, by design, favors corporate favoritism and cronyism and rampant corruption on a financial scale. And all of that corruption came to a head when New York Attorney General Letitia James came out with this announcement.
A stunning announcement. New York State Attorney General Letitia James declaring that the evidence of alleged wrongdoing at the NRA that her office has uncovered shows that the powerhouse gun rights group must be put out of business for good.
The NRA diverted millions and millions of dollars away from its charitable mission for personal use by senior leadership. We are seeking an order to dissolve the NRA in its entirety.
That's right. James filed a lawsuit to dissolve the NRA and hold its board members accountable, to which I assume they responded by saying that she could have their organization when she prized it from their cold, dead hands. Now, since James filed that suit, the NRA has tried to skirt accountability from the law. Last year, the organization tried to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection so that it can move its 501c4 nonprofit organization designation out of New York as well as its headquarters out of Virginia and move them both into Texas, where the gun climate seemed much more friendlier. Unfortunately for them, a federal judge in Texas blocked their ability to file, ruling that the filing was only made to gain an unfair litigation advantage, and therefore it wasn't made in good faith. Because of course it wasn't. They're basically throwing whatever legal tactic at the window and seeing which one sticks there the longest, as if it were a pickle from Billy Madison's burger. And whenever the NRA finds itself on the defensive, they always resort to their usual bag of tricks, like claiming that any gun control measure promoted by Democrats are employed to get rid of the Second Amendment, which, if you've taken a basic civics or government class, would know that's not how constitutional amendments work. Watching LaPierre explain how he thinks constitutional amendments work is like watching a 3-year-old play store. Oh, that's right, Damien, you just give him your rubber ducky and then you get cookies, you tiny idiot. Now, another ploy they like to use is by claiming that the US, a country where the number of guns outnumbers people, doesn't need gun restrictions, and Switzerland is an example of how high gun ownership is linked to little or no mass shootings. But much like that country's cheese, that narrative has some big holes in it. Switzerland is a country that, while deployed troops around the world for peacekeeping missions, it has not been involved in combat situations for 2 centuries. It requires men to serve a minimum of 2 years in its military, which the US doesn't do. It also requires men to be trained to use said weapons and keep them, but are required to obtain a permit to do so. They also require gun sellers to follow strict licensing protocols, and guns be kept out of the hands of those who have been convicted for felonies or have a history of addiction to drugs and or alcohol, or even anyone with violent tendencies. So the NRA isn't giving its members the full picture here. They're basically the one person in history class who forgot to prepare for an oral report. Okay, so what can I say about the 6-Day War? Well, it was quite a war that lasted 6 days, and oh wow, it was quite a war, wasn't it? I think my 10 minutes are up. It's been 30 seconds, Stephen. So the NRA, at this point, is starting to run out of excuses, and people, including its own members, are getting tired of hearing the same excuses over and over again. So the question remains, what happens to the NRA now? Well, I would favor just dissolving the organization completely, as New York's AG has been pushing for. Unfortunately, while a judge recently ruled to allow her lawsuit against the NRA to proceed, that same judge blocked her motion to dissolve the NRA. But what James could do instead is push to have LaPierre and other NRA board members legally barred from serving as directors of any nonprofit group in New York for life, including the NRA, which will allow new leadership to take its place. And if that happens, the organization needs to make some serious changes, like diminish the voices of the gun manufacturers and increase the presence of the voice of the group's members. So ideally, the NRA's members are supposed to be their greatest asset, but as we have explained today, the members themselves and their voices are seen by the NRA's leaders as an afterthought. The organization should also restructure the way elections for its board members are held, like allowing all board seats to be elected positions voted for by dues-paying members. And while Lee Greenwood says he agrees with most of the NRA's positions, he's voiced support for universal background checks, saying that while it won't stop all potential mass shooters, it would at least be considered a step in the right direction. Meanwhile, what needs to be done politically has to be get the Republican Party to change the way it thinks about the NRA, because they've operated for decades under the assumption that if they step out of line with the NRA, the gun lobby will back a primary challenger and force them out of office. And while it happens to some of the politicians all the time, it hasn't happened all the time. Take John Kasich. When he served as a congressman from Ohio in the 90s, he backed the 1994 crime bill that contained the assault weapons ban. And when he ran for governor in 2010, the NRA pushed hard to deny him the Republican nomination for governor, which ultimately failed as he went on to serve 2 terms as Ohio's governor. Another example would be Rick Scott, Florida U.S. Senator and Lex Luthor stunt double. In his last year as governor of Florida, he signed a gun restriction bill that raised the age of buying a rifle to 21 years old and implemented red flag laws, and the NRA punished Scott for doing so by downgrading his NRA letter grade from an A to a C, and despite that, he was elected to the U.S. Senate that same year. And it's important to push Republicans hard to stand up to them, because even though they're hobbled by scandals and financial problems, their lobbying efforts remain very much potent. So it's important that while the NRA is down, it's still not out. And we must do everything we can to show their out-of-touch leaders
doors have.
That's my show. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Good night.